Did Jesus break the Sabbath? Did he do that, really? Is that something he done? Well, we will find ourselves reading an article from our friends over at Apologetics Press, pointing us, of course, to the scriptures and what is revealed regarding that question, that topical trip. It is Thursday, after all, and that is the theme of our session. Did Jesus break the Sabbath? How are you doing out there? You doing okay? Everything fine? Stefan Maya is my name. If you're new here, addedsouls.com is my website. And I labor alongside the East Coast Church of Christ over here on the East Coast of Canada. And you can check out the .com, eastcoastchurchofchrist.com. And we'd love to have you. We'd love to have you come study with us and grow with us. A beautiful, healthy, growing congregation. And it's available there to you, for you. We serve the community, and it's a blessing to do so. It's a blessing to do so. All right, let us go to the screen here and put up the article on the visual. There it is. From apologeticspress.org / Did Jesus Break the Sabbath? If you want to check it out for yourself and read it and study it perhaps with a bit more time and effort than this session can offer, by all means, go ahead and do that. This website has helped me a great deal in my faith to answer some questions I had and stuff like that. So by all means, check it out, apologeticspress.org. Okay, so the title of this article is, Did Jesus Break the Sabbath? Is that something he is guilty of doing? Because he was born, of course, in the lineage of the culture and kind, which is being a Jew. Did he, break the law, God's law, in regards to the Sabbath? Well, the Jewish leadership, of course, would say yes, but was it scripturally so? Is it in reality something he would have done in disobedience against his Father in heaven? Well, let's see what happens here. Let's just read the text. It's from our brother Dave Miller, and it begins as such. I will read. One common misconception regarding the behavior of Jesus is that on occasion, in healing the sick and performing other benevolent actions, he broke the Sabbath in order to accommodate the higher law of love. Now, this viewpoint leaves the impression that law is sometimes, if not frequently, antithetical to being loving. In other words, you can't have both at the same time. You could not have law and love combined. It needs to be one or the other, and if you choose law over love, then you are not a compassionate Christian. You're not a forgiving, kind, and loving Christian. Can't have love if you involve law within that. So, I mean, it's something I've seen in my faith, and speaking to people who claim to have belief in Jesus, who have expressed. And, well, is that reality? Okay. It implies, of course, this position, this thought, this belief that sometimes breaking God's laws is necessary in order to be loving. It needs to be done, and God would expect us to do that. He would want us to set aside his law in order to practice love. Well, this notion, of course, is flawed, and it is contrary to the Bible teaching. For any honest and genuine student seeking to know the reality of God's mind, in accordance to a properly interpreted text, of course, within its context, it's important for us to submit to his will and remove ourselves from perhaps Christianity created in our own image, with our own desires and the way we think Christianity should look like or feel like. That's a difficult one. For many of us, we had to really put aside self, right? Let go pride and all our misconceptions, misinformation, disinformation regarding Christianity and the ocean of Christendom out there that has since created its own belief according to its own emotional investments or selfish desires, perhaps, or maybe sincere, but yet still deceiving. So you and I, we want to just, as simple as it said, we just want to know what the Bible really says about this. Well, believing that we have to set apart law in order to practice love properly is not true. It's just not based in reality. Truth is reality. Thy word is truth. Truth is reality. It calls us out of a dying world. It will set us free from the bondage of all sorts of false religious worldviews, practices, shrines, traditions. It will set us free, of course, from all other practices of iniquity and lawlessness in our life. It's a beautiful thing from the inspired word to be set free from the world of myth and lies that cause us great harm. And you can see how there could be great harm if you believe that you have to set apart or set away God's law, the law of the Christ, in order to practice love. That doesn't seem to be a well-balanced nature that God has revealed of himself. Well, let's keep reading. As Paul explained to the Romans, quote, "He who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, right? Inspired words. Paul meant that when you obey the law's directives concerning how to conduct yourself toward your neighbor, you will be engaging in loving behavior. To love, one must enact God's law. And we have to truly embrace this idea before we keep going here. Just a bit of an excursion in thought for you. I have seen in Christendom, more so accurately within the Lord's house, for those who understand the ancient dialect, brethren, sadly, who have swung the pendulum too far one side or the other. In other words, they either swing it too far and only have law, but they don't have love, or they swing it too far on the other end, and they know love, but they're void of the law. When in fact, if they would just learn how both should find themselves in the middle, balanced and reasonable, to which they are woven together, law and love combined. We sing that song, "Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall." So it's important for us in our faith, if we're growing spiritually, to understand both of those elements together and how they make us productive for His Majesty's reign. Kind and gracious, merciful He is. And we'd be wise to cling to that, to understand that, because there's been great damage done when we do not find the middle, the narrow path, okay? When we fall too far off the beaten path, we go in the ditch. And sadly, we have many brethren who are well-versed in the law, scholarly with the law. They can teach it, they can preach it in great passion. And it charms us because we're like, wow, they really studied that. They know it very well. And it's truly fascinating. Great interest into the manner in which they can deliver the law. And I've learned a great deal from brethren who know the law and have been able to teach me the law in great specificity. It's great categories of understanding. However, though that is indeed a precious gem to hold, the ability to study the law, know the law, proclaim the law, teach the law, if it is found without love, it falls short in a deficit. It's missing the mark because it's found mechanical without the true gem of organic life. It's it can facilitate or become the conduit to a great many self-righteous activities that cause great harm to the local assembly. To know so much law void of the compassion the law teaches us to practice, to have within us in motive and heart, outwardly displayed. So at times, some of these brethren, though they know the law very well, sadly they miss compassion and remorse and a humble heart, and they cause great pain in the church. And in the other way, it's the same kind of issue, because if they are found with all this compassion and kindness and emotional reliability and connection with people, which is good, you should have that. But if it's void of the law, the doctrine, the proper teachings of the Christ, again, it falls in deficit and doesn't produce what it should be producing for your local assembly. So we have to learn how to be really woven into both in one, and understanding how that functions. Okay, so let's go back to the article here from our friends over at apologeticspress.org. And we continue to read. The fact is, the perfect Son of God obeyed all of God's laws. Okay? He didn't break the Sabbath in order to practice love. But give it time. Let's just read together as honest human beings wanting to learn a bit here of the facts of the matter. So the fact is, the perfect Son of God obeyed all of God's laws. The Son obeyed the Father, never violating even one divine precept. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. Scriptural evidence to the fact. Sin is defined as violation of God's law. 1 John 3, 4. And if, of course, the Son would have violated the law, his death on that cross would have been vain. So I don't think we would want to take that position and meet him on that day, saying, yeah, you sinned. You broke your Father's law. Well, let's keep reading. Since Jesus was sinless, and all who adhere or follow the Christ should know that to be an objective, absolute fact in which our faith governs forward to eternity. He never broke God's laws. Hence, he could not have broken the Sabbath. Those who leveled such an accusation against him were in fact mistaken. They were mistaken. So let's take the time here to read this article and see where it points to scripturally in evidence. So we remember the pool, right? This is the witnessed and recorded account. Take, for example, the incident in John 5. When Jesus caused a man who suffered from a 38-year-old ailment, imagine that, to rise from his bed of confinement and walk? Wow. The fact that Jesus' action took place on the Sabbath drew the criticism of the Jews, who promptly informed the man, it is the Sabbath, quote, it is not lawful for you to carry your bed, verse 10. Of course, they are seeking to impugn a breach of legality in which Christ would be guilty of lawlessness. And these critics, or these hostile agencies, should have embraced him and known who he was. In accordance to the scriptures, they were born and raised to read, write, and recite, and teach and preach. But their hearts were so hardened against him. They had fallen prey to all sorts of corrupt, prideful ways. And they tried to find fault in him, fault finders, if you will. Now, of course, the Holy Spirit, through his penmanship of the New Testament law, greatly guides us to stay away from being fault finders, trying to find fault, create sin, find him guilty of sin, and then, of course, reject him, neglect him, reject him, and force a withdrawal from him. Sadly, many such pharisaical tactics and diatrophic spirits are well and alive in the church and do the same. We've witnessed it ourselves. And it brings much pain and division, unnecessary, unrighteous division. Many would suppose that Jesus would not be concerned with careful conformity to the law. they would assume that he would chide the Jews for their, quote, nitpicky legalistic, right? And we hear that quite often, nitpicky legalistic approach to religion, and that he would be quite willing to dismiss the requirements of the law in order to give priority to human need in the name of compassion. And that makes me think of something kind of like the idea behind stealing bread if you're starving. Right? It's okay to break the law, to produce an act of lawlessness, if indeed it calls for a desperate measure, which is starvation. I'm going to starve to death if I don't steal bread, so I'm going to steal bread. Now, that might seem acceptable or justified on its surface, and a great many would adhere to that. Myself once, in my past life. Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, if I'm starving, I'm going to do what I got to do. Well, where does that end? Can I extinguish another man's or woman's life, innocent life, if it is in a moment of despair or immediate an emergency of sorts? Like, well, I think we'd say, well, no, the line would stop there. No one gets hurt, really, if you just steal a loaf of bread from a company that has a full warehouse of loaves of bread. Well, I don't know. I don't know if that is justifiable, is it? I don't think it is, scripturally. Thievery can't be justified because an individual is found starving for food. Now, we would certainly want to look into the window of opportunity for any benevolent help, and there are, of course, departments for that, and there is the ability of such things. But again, the world has its way to try to find a gray area in sin and justify it, and they do that by creating this ethical dilemma. They're very good at that. Hollywood is king. I mean, I got to give it up to Hollywood. They are very cunning. My wife and I will watch certain shows or series or movies, and we're like, there it is. There's Hollywood. Having you doubt the word of God by creating this very cunning ethical dilemma. Like, yeah, what am I going to do? I mean, I'm starving to death. There's no other way, and I have to steal a loaf of bread to eat. They're very good at that. But the fact is, in reality, like if you take the feelings away from it and you find yourself in an honorable court of law with tangible evidence to be defended, you'll go to jail or you'll have a consequence for stealing bread. You are guilty of thievery, which is an act of lawlessness. Now, did you need to do that? I don't believe so. I think there are other ways that God has blessed us with the ingenuity of our thoughts to, well, perhaps obviously, number one, work for the bread. But number two, family, church culture, community. He's given us so many departments of opportunity to receive these blessings or these benevolent opportunities. Let's keep reading there. Just a thought, a bit of an excursion there for our thoughts as the topic moves forward. Okay, so in regards to such view, right? Such a view that you put away law in order to practice love, stuff like that, to justify that. But this viewpoint is fraught with error, not the least of which is its demeaning assessment of law which God himself authored. Law, according to God, is given for human well-being. Deuteronomy 6:24, 10:13, Proverbs 29:18. God's law is, quote, holy and just and good, Romans 7:12. So should we set that aside? And serves divinely intended, positive purposes. An example, Romans 3:20. Now, indeed, Jesus' handling of his critics illustrates the high regard he had for law, the necessity of carefully conforming to that law, and the critical importance of applying it accurately. Now, why would Jesus go through such a strenuous effort to make sure we know that? Well, because I don't know. He doesn't want us to set aside the law. He wants us to be active in his law at all times, which, of course, governs us, guides us, instructs us, commands us to love. So one is not violating the other or in opposition or contradiction. Law and love combined. I cannot stress it enough. And for those of you who've been following me for a while, you know this is on repeat. I know you may say the record is broken, Stefan. Well, I can't stop repeating it because the Bible just continuously repeats it. Law and love combined. We've been set free from the law. Well, we've been set free from the Old Testament law. We've been set free from the ordinances and traditions and the laws that man has created from their own mind or selfish ambitions. Yeah, we've been set free from sin. We've been set free from a great many things. But God is not saying, you no longer need to obey my law. He has a law. You and I, we live submissive to that law, the 27 books of the New Testament. We no longer live submissive to the 39 books of the Old Testament, though we are commanded to read, to learn God's nature, to accumulate practical application through principle in those scriptures. But we're not commanded. No, we're no longer commanded to submit ourselves to the 39 books of the Old Testament law, because you and I, we live in a Christian age, the age of the Messiah. Okay, we live under the 27 books of the New Testament law. That's why we're not sacrificing animals anymore, and we're not finding ourselves practicing Saturday's Sabbath. Some do, of course, calling themselves Sabbatarians, and they are in error, and sadly, eternally lost. No, we follow the Christ and his 27 books of the New Testament law. And of course, interestingly, in his 27 books of the new law, to which he bled for, the Gospel of Matthew reveals, very similar commands are given. And sin is sin. Sin remains. And we know that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Though he has changed the dispensation and the history of our time now within this new covenant, he is still the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So we have to be truly wise with that. The New Testament system, of course, and I believe this article will probably share it soon, speaks of a law, the law of Christ. The 27 books of the New Testament law is the law of Jesus Christ. It's a more mature law, so we are wise to take the time to educate ourselves. Christianity is an educated religion, and it has to be in the accordance of the author's intent for our minds. So in other words, we have to deny ourselves and pick up the cross daily and follow him. We have to let go, quote-unquote, Christianity in the image of men and the desires they have according to flesh. It may be sincere at times. It may be malicious at others or sinister. Either or. We have to permit the pure gospel of Christ to save us. Save us from the ocean of error out there. Very important. Law and love combined. The article continues here from our friends over at apologeticspress.org. And my dear friends, please consider subscribing, liking, following, sharing, engaging the material, the session. Others out there might find value. It might give us a bit of an algorithm wave and permit us to be seen, to reach others out there. So please consider it. Okay, so we keep reading here. In John 7, calling attention to the miracle he performed in chapter 5, Jesus offered a logical rebuttal to the allegation that he violated the Sabbath. Here is that argument placed in syllogistic form. Okay, it begins and it says, premise number 1, if the law of Moses requires the circumcision of a male infant on the 8th day after birth, even when the 8th day falls on the Sabbath, then healing a man on the Sabbath is equally legal. Premise number 2, the law of Moses requires the circumcision of a male infant on the 8th day after birth, even when the 8th day fell on the Sabbath. Conclusion. Therefore, because premise 1 and premise 2, healing a man on the Sabbath is equally legal. Now, if you are found with tangible evidence of such like in a court of law, an honorable court of law, the logic, of course, is a sense we should all have in common. The article continues. Jesus then offered a concluding admonition that kinched? Is that how you pronounce that? I'm a French guy speaking English words here. Kinched? Is that how that works? Kinched the validity of his argument. Quote, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Called to judge, but there is a quality in our judgment that must be upheld. What is that? God's will. How so? Righteous. Judge a person rightly. That's very important. Making application of God's laws based on appearance refers to doing so based on how things seem or look to the person making the judgment. In other words, forming an opinion based on inadequate evidence. Inadequate evidence. Oh, and how that has brought much sorrow in the local assembly when brethren, perhaps in positions of leadership, shepherding, elders perhaps, pulpit minister or preacher, evangelist, who sadly judge unrighteously. And we can do so upon how should I say, the malicious words of a slanderer or things of that kind. It's just so important that we learn how to righteously judge, that we seek the evidence, because devils can have a very cunning tongue, quite persuasive, to have us believe a lie in regards to another brother or sister that they may have maliciously sought to destroy. Perhaps bitterness, jealousy, greed, pride, preeminence, things like that. So we are wise to work our way through unrighteous judgments so as to not participate in such things and remain balanced with law and love. Inadequate evidence will create much pain in a local assembly. And the devil, he preys on vulnerable individuals who are not well versed in law and love and righteous judgment. The article continues, again, from our friends over at apologetexpress.org. To the contrary, to, quote, judge with righteous judgment means to make accurate assessments by drawing only warranted conclusions from the evidence. In other words, thinking and acting rationally. Not based on trust from someone we may love dearly who may be misguiding us, nonetheless, maybe sincerely misguiding us, meaning he or she is not willfully understanding that they are sharing a lie or sharing a gossip or a slander or things like that. So again, you have to be independently accountable to these things with your own intellectual capabilities to say, you know what, I know mom is the one telling me this and I trust mom. If mom is not producing the evidence. Now, if mom is producing the evidence saying, son, listen, this is a righteous judgment upon this brother or sister or upon this, that, and the other, and here's the evidence, then you're like, oh, okay, all right. See, Christ, when he spoke about the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23, where, the whole list of woes to the description of the delinquency that was being practiced by their behavior, the Pharisees, the self-righteous and hypocrites, and he produced the evidence to the charge. They are self-righteous hypocrites, and here's the evidence, right? That's different. That's righteous. That permits individuals to have a righteous judgment upon the Pharisees, not an unrighteous one. The unrighteous way would be how the Pharisees treated Jesus. Remember what the Pharisees said of Jesus? Oh, he's a deceiver, They were he's a deceiver, he's a liar, he's the devil himself, he's a thief, he's a blasphemer, Well, okay, where's the evidence for that? Now, and you can understand how their loyalists would have trusted them. They're scholarly men. They know the law. And if they say that about Jesus, then it must be true. Because these are men that have led us religiously for years. We trust them wholeheartedly. Perhaps they've even been kind to some of us. So if they say Jesus is a deceiver and a liar and a glutton and a winebibber and this, that, and the other, well, it must be true. We'll just trust that. And there's kind of this loyalty to a certain fold and school of thought. Sadly, we see the same today in certain Bible schools. They're trained militantly to never betray one another, even if one of their own is a wicked, evil individual. Nope, have to protect our kind, our loyalty to each other, even when lawlessness is taking place. When lawlessness is recorded, it doesn't matter. No, we gotta stick up for our friend. Your friend's a devil. He has a long resume of destruction and chaos and disorder and pain and sorrow that he brings upon people. You can defend him all you want. It's going to be a sobering moment when you meet Jesus on that day. Righteous judgment. The difference, of course, Jesus, when he was describing the character of the religious leaders, he gave evidence. He's like, here's what makes them this. Here's why. And the descriptive nature and the evidence provided allows us to read and be like, oh, wow, we know that to be true. It would have, But on the other end, the religious leaders just cunningly, persuasively telling the people, oh, he's a deceiver, he's a blasphemer. To blindly trust that would have you in a deficit. And some brethren, they can't discern that. It was a challenge to my faith when I recognized that. And I myself at one time, just devoured by the deception of it all. Some brethren can't. After Jesus would have said what he said in Matthew 23, some brethren would have been like, you guys should just all get along. You're all brothers. You're all Jews. It's fine. You should, and would have kept supporting both parties and just incapable of having the courage to discern what's taking place here and how Jesus is lovingly calling us away from the shackles of these gatekeepers. There was a time I thought I needed a scholar to help us. No, I just need the Bible. That's all we need. We need law and love. And Christ will grow his faithful fold. We got to be careful about those things. It's very important. Law and love. So when we hear things like, well, we should be removed from the law. We don't need to obey the law. There is no longer any law because love. It's a deceiving lie. It's just not true. Okay, so we have to really pay attention to that. One must be very careful that he is accurately handling the word of truth. 2 Timothy 2:15. Okay, we are called to do that. Because if we're not accurately handling the word of truth, we are creating an interpretation that is based upon our own selfish desires. And I can fall prey to that as much as anybody. Because if your heart is driven in delinquency, let's say you have a bitter heart, or you have a heart filled with retaliation or vindictiveness or greed or preeminence and pride, you're going to find a way to utilize the scriptures and divide them in such a way that you will fulfill your selfish desires. And again, such men and women in local assemblies will cause unrighteous division and will practice cunning lies and cause a lot of pain. So you want to make sure, my dear friends, that we don't do that we approach the text of the scriptures to rightly handle them with a pure heart, pure motive of the heart. Again, spirit and truth. You can't have one without the other. If you have one without the other, you're in a deficit, you are a liability, and you will find yourself with eternal consequence. You have to have the right motive of the heart, humble, submissive, reverent, and bowed before God with the right doctrine, the doctrine of our Lord and Master. So we are indeed called to carefully utilize the Word of God and not handling the word of God deceitfully. 2 Corinthians 4:2. Can't do that. Can't do that. So we looked at the pool. Now we look at the synagogue in our article here from our friends over at apologeticpress.org. The synagogue. Another instance in which Jesus was falsely accused of breaking the Sabbath is seen on the occasion when Jesus entered the synagogue and encountered a man who had a deformed hand. Remember that? Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 13. I encourage you, of course, to read that. This circumstance prompted his enemies to ask him a question in hopes of being able to accuse him of breaking the law. And again, the character and behavioral delinquencies of these sorts, that's what they do. We've witnessed that in our lives as well, from an intrusive infiltration. Individuals who were very cunning with this. They would find fault. They create a law, and in their corrupted mind, believe it firmly from God, void of the reality, of course, that they just came up with this law. And then they'll find a way to find you guilty of that. They'll find a flaw or create this accusation, if you will, and from that, seek to remove you, push you away, or whatever their agenda is to that end. So, this is the action they took place with against Christ. This circumstance prompted his enemies to ask him a question in hopes of being able to accuse him of breaking the law. They asked, quote, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Right? Well, of course, they had predecided that the answer to the question was no. And that, in fact, the law would naturally forbid such an action. Unfortunately, the prevailing interpretation of the law of Moses at the time, at least among the Jewish leaders, was that the Sabbath law enjoined total inactivity, as if everyone was to sit down for 24 hours and do absolutely nothing. Again, these sorts will create a law. They will create these laws. You're breaking the law. You're not permitted to do, X, Y, and Z. It's like, what? That's not a law. That doesn't even come from the Bible. What do you mean? But they'll find a book, chapter, verse. They'll manipulate the book, chapter, verse, and then they'll bind this law on you. And the Jews, what was it? Over 600 of them, these ordinances. Some of them, of course, in utility. Not all of them were a heavy-handed, malicious concoction from the mind of these religious leaders just to oppress people. Some of them, they bound in utility. However, they were not to be bound. Like it wasn't something God said, it's bound. It's my law. It needs to be enforced. Not at all. It was the mind of man and their selfish ambitions, or at time, a sincere plea to make their faith better, if you will, that with tradition and time became the law. Why don't you listen to your chief priest or your elders, or well, because it's not a law that God set in stone here. This is from the mind of man, and these sorts they're very cunning with it. They can be very good with it. Again, I've experienced that firsthand upon my own life from these sorts, this kind of a corrupted spirit, just to find this law they bind on you, right? So here they thought they were going to get Jesus. Ran out of town, right? Because he's breaking the law. He's not supposed to be doing anything at all on Sabbath. Well, this view was a distortion, of course, of God's law on the matter that they had since created in their own image. And that's, I can't stress this enough. That's what happens. People will, these sorts, okay, that are not humble and pure, that are not innocently seeking to know God and to know his law properly. These sorts, they know how to use the intricate details of the text for their selfish ambition, their selfish desires. Again, driven by bitterness, greed, retaliation, vindictiveness, preeminence, pride. And they're very persuasive with it, quite charming. And you can fall prey to that if you are vulnerable. And you can find yourself devoured. I know what that experience is all about. And I can certainly defend it in court with tangible evidence. So we have to understand this in the church. It's a reality, and it's a threat that we have to learn how to navigate, persevere, and also call out, mark, and stay far away from these sorts. This view was a distortion of God's law on the matter, no doubt. The law gave the right, even the obligation, to engage in several activities that could rightly be designated work. That did not constitute violation of the Sabbath regulation. It just didn't. On this occasion, Jesus pinpointed one such instance. Quote, "What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out?" Verse 11 here. Jesus was recalling a directive from the law of Moses. Interesting, isn't it? Quote, "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray, and hide yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother. And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. You shall do the same with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garment. With any lost thing of your brother's, which he has lost and you have found, you shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road, and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift them up again." The Deuteronomic law. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 1 through 4, and you can compare that with Exodus chapter 23, verses 4 and 5. Now, such passages give insight into the nature of God and provide tremendous assistance in making proper application of God's laws to everyday circumstances. Observe that God's laws never contradict or countermand each other, unlike man-made laws, which often manifest inconsistency and contradiction. True indeed, and if you pay attention to these sorts, you will be able to discern them. You will be able to discern them. And they also create these laws, and they bind it on you and find you guilty of violating it when they themselves are quite permissible to it. It's the height of hypocrisy. And these Pharisaical kinds, these diotrephic spirits, they practice it all the time if you're paying attention to it. If you're paying attention to it, you have to just listen to what they're saying and how they're saying it, right? How should I say? Okay, you're not permitted to do this. The Bible says you're not permitted to do this because if you do this, it's a sin. But I can do it, and I know how to do it. And here's other Bible verses that say that I can do this. But it's a sin if you do it, but it's not if I do it. So they'll go to a certain Bible verse to say, here you go. And it may be a real law. It may be a true and genuine law from the Bible that says, this is a sin if you practice this. And they'll be like, see, it's a sin if you practice this. But here's why it's not a sin if I practice this. And here are other Bible verses that I'm going to utilize in a very cunning way to prove that I can practice this certain sin here, and it'd be fine. Okay? Again, it's the height of hypocrisy if you're truly paying attention. You'll be able to discern them that way. Ye shall know them by their fruits. You know, what are the students learning from the teacher? What are they doing? What's their behavior? Very, very, very important for us to learn. So unlike man-made laws, which often manifest inconsistency and contradiction, God's laws function in perfect harmony with each other. The Mosaic passage to which Jesus alluded demonstrates that the general principle of the cessation of usual work on the Sabbath did not conflict with any number of specific circumstances in which benevolence and compassion were to be expressed. Okay? In an agriculturally based society, a family's survival depends on its farm animals, right? If a sheep, ox, or donkey were to break out of its stall, flee the premises, and then fall into a pit from which it would be unable to extricate? extricate itself, right? To basically remove itself or save itself, the animal would most likely die or become seriously ill if left in its predicament for 24 hours. To extend the necessary effort, in other words, the work to retrieve the animal from danger, was not considered by God to be included in the Sabbath's prohibition. And obviously, the nature of God, the more you study, you'll understand that He has designed His law to instruct compassion, and how it is not a violation of His law to work this compassion upon the Sabbath. And so they're trying to charge Jesus with something that just, it won't work. Trying to nail Jello to the wall, and just not going to happen. Hence, Jesus stated the logical conclusion, quote, "Of how much more value, then, is a man than a sheep?" Very interesting. I actually proclaimed this portion, or this account, to my fellow brethren here at the East Coast Church of Christ just several weeks ago. It is a truly fascinating account that gives us much insight, challenges us, of course, to understand what's happening here, the priority and the responsibility, and so on and so forth. If action could be exerted to see to the well-being of a dumb animal, then obviously God would approve of action taken to see to the physical care of a human being. We are more important than the donkey, aren't we not? Well, of course we are. So if you can retrieve the donkey and not call it work on the Sabbath, but somehow helping our fellow man, healing our fellow man, is a work and a violation of the Sabbath, well, that's a far stretch. There's a problem there. Here, once again, is Jesus' argument placed in syllogistic form. Premise number 1. And this, of course, is designed to help us with logical format understand exactly what's happening here. If the law of Moses requires a person to manifest care, concern, and physical effort to recover a neighbor's escaped endangered farm animal, even when the incident occurs on the Sabbath, then healing a man on the Sabbath is equally legal. Premise number 2. The law of Moses requires a person to manifest care, concern, and physical effort to recover a neighbor's escaped endangered farm animal, even when the incident occurs on the Sabbath. So in conclusion, therefore, healing a man on the Sabbath is equally legal. It's equally legal. And it's the nature of God to hold such compassion. Here's one for you. Brother so-and-so and his family, they arrived late on Sunday for worship, right? They're a good 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half hour late. Where were you? You've broken the law. You were supposed to be here on time before we started. What's the matter with you? And immediately this judgment is taking place, and this condemnation upon our brother and his family. Why did you... And he's like, wait, please, brother, don't charge me with any accusations of such things. I want to explain what happened, why I'm late. Well, an individual was hurt on the side of the road on the way here, and he was alone, and so we stopped and we helped this individual, and we had to bring him to the hospital, and it had been in an accident. That doesn't matter at all. You broke the law. You were supposed to be here on time, and you didn't make it on time. You broke the law. Now, I'm giving you, of course, a bit of an illustration to the fact, but you can see how that seems unbalanced, not reasonable at all. Doesn't seem to be the nature of God and His compassion. Of course it's understandable. Of course God wanted our brother and his family to stop and help this fellow neighbor who had just been in a car accident and needed assistance, even if that meant they were going to be a half hour late to be with the church on Sunday to worship God. Law and love combined. Law and love combined. We have to understand and discern the difference here, and what is proper and what is not, what is right and what is wrong, right? So the logic is penetrating and decisive. Indeed, quote, they could not answer him regarding these things. Nope, they had nothing to say there anymore. That quieted them pretty well. Luke chapter 14, verse 6, and you can see also Luke chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. Far from suggesting that law is unimportant and may be ignored under the guise of, quote, human need, or implying that humans can break the letter of the law in order to keep the spirit of the law, Jesus demonstrated that inherently built into God's laws are all concerns deemed by deity to be necessary. The benevolent, loving thing to do will always harmonize with God's laws. Since, quote, love is the fulfillment of the law, Romans 13:10, in other words, every truly loving action has already been defined by God in his legal admonitions. We move forward to the other portion of this article called the grain field. We did the pool, and now we're at the grain field. The grain field. This is an article from our friends over at apologeticpress.org if you seek to read it again or with a bit more depth or time to study and things like that, okay? So it says, in regards to the grain field, a final instance in which Jesus was accused of breaking the Sabbath is seen in the grain field incident. Matthew 12, verses 1 through 8. Many commentators automatically assume that the charge leveled against Jesus' disciples by the Pharisees was a scripturally valid charge. However, when the disciples picked and consumed a few heads of grain from a neighbor's field, they were doing that which was perfectly lawful. Deuteronomy 23:25. Working would have been a violation of the Sabbath law. If they had pulled out a sickle and begun harvesting the grain, they would have been violating the Sabbath law. However, they were picking strictly for the purpose of eating immediately, an action that was in complete harmony with Mosaic legislation. Quote, but that which everyone must eat, Exodus 12:16. A modern equivalent might be reaching for a box of cereal on the pantry shelf, pouring it in a bowl, retrieving the milk from the refrigerator, pouring it on the cereal, and eating it. The Pharisees charged that the disciples were doing something, quote, not lawful on the Sabbath, was implying, or simply, sadly, or on the Sabbath, was simply an erroneous charge. It's just not true. Compare that with Matthew 15, verse 2. Jesus commenced to counter their accusation with masterful, penetrating logic, advancing successive rebuttals. And we have much to learn from Christ, and we ought to follow his way. It will certainly serve us right. Before he presented specific scriptural refutation of their charge, he first employed a rational device designated by logicians as argumentum ad hominem, literally, quote, argument to the man. He used the, quote, circumstantial form of this argument, which enabled him to, quote, point out a contrast between the opponent's lifestyle and his expressed opinions, thereby suggesting that the opponent and his statements can be dismissed as hypocritical. This variety of argumentation spotlights the opponent's inconsistency and, quote, charges the adversary with being so prejudiced that his alleged reasons are mere rationalizations of conclusions deducted by self-interest. In other words, again, selfish ambition, fleshly gain and desire. These religious leaders were not in it to be submissive, humble, loving, kind, compassionate leaders. They were in it for their, again, love of money, bitterness, vindictiveness, jealousy, pride, preeminence, control, the praise of men they sought, and Jesus was a threat to all of that, so he needed to go. So they had to find a law that he was guilty of and call him, a blasphemer and a violator of the law and so on and so forth. And these same types have the same spirit today, and they will infiltrate local assemblies if you're not paying attention, if you're not aware of your surroundings, if you're not on your guard. They will intrusively infiltrate themselves in your life and they will cause all sorts of harm. They will. We know it firsthand. So Jesus, of course, sees this corruption, this toxic behavioral delinquency, and he can dismantle it, refute it. It's drenched in hypocrisy. Observe carefully the technical sophistication inherent in Jesus' strategy. He called attention to the case of David, verses 3 and 4. When David was in exile, literally running for his life to escape the jealous, irrational rage of Saul, he and his companions arrived in Nob, tired and hungry, 1 Samuel 21. He lied to the priest and conned him into giving to his traveling companions the showbread, or, quote, bread of the presence, which is 12 flat cakes arranged in 2 rows on the table within the tabernacle, Exodus 25, verses 23 to 30, Leviticus 24, verses 5 and 6. This bread that legally was reserved only for the priest, Leviticus 24, 8 to 9, compared with Exodus 29, 31 through 34, Leviticus 8, 31, 22, 10, and following. David clearly violated the law. Did the Pharisees condemn him? Well, absolutely not. Well, of course not. He's one of ours. He's one of our friends. We look up to David. He's a hero. He's a bastion of our faith. He's a light into our lives. Of course, he can't be found guilty of such a thing, but Jesus somehow and his disciples, they are. And there's a difference there. It's interesting how they will do this. Again, it's the same today. It's the same today. We've witnessed it. We've seen it. These individuals are blind to it. So, absolutely not, obviously. They revered David. They held him in high regard. In fact, nearly 1,000 years after his passing, his tomb was still being tended. Acts chapter 2:29, compared with 1 Kings 2:10, Nehemiah 3:16, Josephus, and his literature, his writings, sorry. So, on the other hand, they condemned the disciples of Jesus who were innocent. They had not broken the law. But on the other hand, they upheld and revered David, who was guilty. They do the same thing today. They do the same thing today. Once you've become a victim of these sorts of abuse from those who claim to be Christians, some of them even gospel preachers, the hypocrisy is it just screams at you from what they practice. It's mind numbing, really. It'll have you question your sanity. I questioned mine for a while. I'm like, this can't be happening. This can't be real. It is. They were doing the same thing to Jesus in the first century, his disciples, the apostles, and all faithful Christians in the first century. Their inconsistency betrayed both their insincerity as well as their ineligibility to bring a charge against the disciples. It just would not hold in a court of law. It's just not lawful. Okay? After exposing their hypocrisy and inconsistency, Jesus next turned to answer the charge pertaining to violating the Sabbath. He called their attention to the priest who worked in the temple on the Sabbath. Okay? The priests were, quote, blameless, not guilty of violating the Sabbath law because their work was authorized to be performed on that day. As previously noted, the Sabbath law did not imply that everyone who was to sit down and do nothing. The law gave the right, even the obligation, to engage in several activities that did not constitute violation of the Sabbath regulation. Again, examples of such authorization included eating, temple service, circumcision, John 7:22, tending to the basic care of animals, Exodus 23, 4 and 5, Deuteronomy 22, 1 through 4, Matthew 12:11, Luke 13:15, and extending kindness or assistance to the needy, Matthew 12:12, Luke 13:16, John 5:5-9, 7:23, so on. The divinely authorized Sabbath activity of the priest proved that the accusation of the Pharisees brought against Jesus' disciples was false, just would not stand in an honorable court of law. The profane is an example of the figure of speech known as metonymy of the adjunct, in which, quote, things are spoken of according to appearance, opinions formed respecting them, or the claims made for them. By this figure, Leah was said to be the mother of Joseph in Genesis 37:10. Joseph was said to be the father of Jesus in Luke 2:48 and John 6:42. God's preached message was said to be foolishness in 1 Corinthians 1:21, and angels were said to be men. An example, Genesis 18:16 and 19:10. Priestly activity on the Sabbath gave the appearance of violation when in fact it was not. Coincidentally, Bullinger classified the allusion to, quote, profane in this verse as an instance of catachresis or incongruity, stating that, quote, it expresses what was true according to the mistaken notion of the Pharisees as to manual works performed on the Sabbath. After pointing out obvious legality of priestly effort expended on the Sabbath, Jesus stated, quote, but I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. Chapter 12, verse 6. The underlying Greek text actually has, quote, something instead of one. If priests could carry on tabernacle/temple service on the Sabbath, surely Jesus' own disciples were authorized to engage in service in the presence of the Son of God. After all, service directed to the person of Jesus certainly is greater than the pre-Christianity temple service conducted by Old Testament priests. For all practical purposes, the discussion was over. Jesus had disproved the claim of the Pharisees, but he did not stop there. He took his methodical confrontation to yet another level. He penetrated beneath the surface argument that the Pharisees had posited and focused on their hearts. Quote, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Chapter 12, verse 7. In this verse, Jesus quoted from an Old Testament context, Hosea 6:6, in which the prophet of old struck a blow against the mere external, superficial, ritualistic observance of some laws, to the neglect of heartfelt, sincere, humble attention to other laws while treating people properly. Oh, and how we beg God that brethren would understand this. Most important. When they don't, they cause so much problems in the local assembly. The comparison is evident. The Pharisees who confronted Jesus' disciples were not truly interested in obeying God's law. They were masquerading under that pretense. Compare that with Matthew 15:1 through 9 and 23:3. But their problem did not lie in an attitude of desiring careful compliance with God's law. Rather, their zest for law-keeping was hypocritical and unaccompanied by their own obedience and concern for others. This is so spot on and descriptive to these Pharisaical kinds, these diatrophic spirits. They possessed critical hearts and were more concerned with scrutinizing and blasting people than with honest, genuine application of God's directives for the good of mankind. And that's why they're never fruitful, and that's why they have a resume of unrighteous, divisive ways, and corruption, and bitterness, and jealousy, and pride, and hypocrisy. And they leave behind a trail of devastation and sorrow and pain and loss. They truly do destroy families, marriages, local assemblies, friendships, and some brethren can't discern it. They just can't discern it, so they keep supporting it. And it's so sad and unfortunate that they will never seek to know the true love and law of Christ. It's just so sad. We've seen it firsthand, witnessed it firsthand. So the article continues from our friends here over at apologetexpress.org. They had neutralized the true intent of divine regulations, making void the word of God, Matthew 15:6. They had ignored and skipped over the significant laws that enjoined justice, mercy, and faith, Matthew 23:23. Consequently, Though their attention to legal detail was laudable, their misapplication of it, as well as their own neglect and rejection of some aspects of it, made them inappropriate and unqualified promulgators of God's laws. Indeed, they simply did not fathom the teaching of Hosea 6:6, compared with Micah 6:6 through 8. Quote, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, is a Hebraism. Hebraism? I don't know how to pronounce that, but that's what it says. Compare that with Matthew 9:13, okay? God was not saying that he did not want sacrifices offered under the Old Testament economy. Notice the use of more in Hosea 6:6. Rather, he was saying that he did not want sacrifice alone. He wanted mercy with sacrifice. Obey the law. Do so with the right motive of the heart. And the law, if you have the right motive of the heart to follow its instruction, you will see the compassion that is necessary for your fellow man. Internal motive and attitude are just as important to God as the external compliance with specifics. It just is. And anyone trying to tell you otherwise, that it is not important, he's trying to manipulate you, to devour you, to take advantage of you. I've seen it firsthand. I know all the intricate details of these sorts and how they operate and how they devour. Okay? Samuel addressed this same attitude shown by Saul. Quote, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. 1 Samuel 15:22. Samuel was not minimizing the essentiality of sacrifice as required by God. He just wasn't doing that. Rather, he was convicting Saul of the pretense of using one aspect of God's requirements, in other words, alleged sacrifice of the best animals, 1 Samuel 15:15, as a smokescreen for violating God's instructions. In other words, failing to destroy all the animals, 1 Samuel 15:3. If the Pharisees had understood these things, they would not have accused the disciples of breaking the law when the disciples, in fact, had not done so. They, quote, would not have condemned the guiltless, Matthew 12:7. While the disciples were guilty of violating an injunction that the Pharisees had concocted, supposing the injunction to be a genuine implication of the Sabbath regulation, of course, the disciples were not guilty of a violation of Sabbath law. The Pharisees' propensity for enjoining their uninspired and erroneous interpretations of Sabbath law upon others was the direct result of cold, unmerciful hearts that found a kind of sadistic glee in binding burdens upon people for burden's sake, rather than in encouraging people to obey God genuinely. And they still do that today in the same way. They still do it today in the same way. Jesus placed closure on his exchange with the Pharisees on this occasion by asserting the accuracy of his handling of this entire affair. Quote, For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, verse 8. In other words, Jesus affirmed his deity and therefore his credentials and authoritative credibility for making accurate application of the law of Moses to the issue at hand. One can trust Jesus' exegesis and application of Sabbath law. After all, he wrote it. Matthew 12 does not teach that Jesus broke the Sabbath or sanctions occasional violation of his laws under extenuating circumstances. His laws are never optional, relative, or situational, even though people often find God's will inconvenient and difficult. In other words, or an example, John 6:60, Matthew 11:6, 1 Corinthians 1:23, Mark 6:3, and other verses. The truth of the matter is that if the heart is receptive to God's will, his will is easy, Matthew 11:30, not too hard, Deuteronomy 30:11, nor burdensome, 1 John 5:3. Okay, most important. If on the other hand, the heart resists his will and does not desire to conform to it, then God's words are, quote, offensive, Matthew 15:12, hard, John 6:60, narrow, Matthew 7:14, and like a hammer that breaks in pieces and grinds the resistor into powder, Jeremiah 23:29, Matthew 21:44. So, in conclusion here, with our friends over at Apologetics Press, apologeticspress.org, if you were seeking to read the article again with a bit more time and study, by all means, check it out. But conclusion here, it says, the religion of Christ surpasses all human religion. It is rooted in the very essence of deity. When Jesus took on human form on earth, he showed himself to be the master logician and exegete who always conducted himself in a rational manner and conformed his actions to divine law. May we do likewise. May we do likewise. Did Jesus break the Sabbath law? No. Did his disciples? No. On the occasions recorded in which the religious leaders of the day tried to find and bind upon them, it was indeed a self-righteous activity. They themselves were in violation of the law against their own brother. And that is, sadly, the delinquency of these sorts, these types. They will do that. They will do that. And some of us, we have the scars to prove it. We lived through these kinds. They're very destructive. Very destructive. Shepherds are wise to be on guard and secure the flock away from these sorts. We must follow the law of the Christ, the 27 books of the New Testament system to which Christ bled for. We must be reverent, humble, and submissive to that law. And at no time are we to violate that law or neglect and reject that law to practice love. It's actually well woven within the law to practice love and how both are together. And if we understand that, our faith will grow stronger and we will become more productive as humble servants. It's most important. It's just brought so much insight to my mind. When you go through some deep trauma at the hands of evil workers, you begin to read the scriptures with a more so deeper water, profound understanding of the context. And you can recognize the descriptive nature of these sorts quite clearly now. You can discern them very clearly. The red flags are now very apparent, and you can see it. These sorts are corrupt. They always seek to find fault in the faithful, and they will slander. They will lie, bold-faced lies, and they cause much pain. And we are wise to adhere to the scriptures and avoid them at all cost. Jesus was pure. Jesus was perfect. And he did not break any law. He was submissive to his Father in heaven. He was humble to participate in humanity, to liberate us, to have freedom in him. And he gave us the uniqueness of his assembly and the uniqueness of his plan of salvation to which we can enter into his assembly. And he has taught us the governing independence of his local assemblies. And he's brought us so much compassion and care and mercy and grace. It would be sad, a sad existence. And it's quite unfortunate that some will never fully know Jesus and his love. It's a sad existence to find ourselves as these Pharisees or these diatrophic spirits, missing the mark so much, fully convinced in their minds they are that they're righteous, what mind science would call as sociopathic narcissists. These sorts, they are masters at gaslighting and projecting, and again, mind science verbiage. Jesus had to deal with those in the first century. It's so sad that they're just missing it. Their hearts are corrupted. These sorts in your life, They will cause great pain, great pain. And they were seeking to cause a lot of problems for Jesus and his disciples and the Christians of the first century. And we are wise to learn from that. We're wise to learn that insight and to stick with love. Here at the East Coast Church of Christ, check out the .com, eastcoastchurchofchrist.com. God made us a people pure and humble and faithful and loving, not perfect. Obviously, we struggle. We are human beings, and we find ourselves at times struggling in temptation, and temptation can come in many forms. But through Christ, we are made perfect, and we persevere another day together, arm in arm. We are innocent as children to that end in Christ, looking at each other's strengths and helping each other when we find weakness. And it's a beautiful assembly. But it came, and it came about by the hands of evil individuals who caused much pain. And God was so merciful to call us away from these Pharisaical types, these diatrophic souls, these abusers and manipulators. I can't express to you enough how much thanks we have to God for him rescuing us in such a way. It humbled us, it disciplined us, it had us repent from our own flaws and delinquencies and our weaknesses. It truly taught us to see much deeper what Jesus wrote, what his apostles wrote, and how from something on the moment quite tragic birthed something flourishing and beautiful. Again, from the tragedy of the cross, in which Christ was crucified and the devil thought himself victorious, was birthed the salvation of mankind. Sometimes God will permit an evil thing to take place. And from that rubble, when the smoke clears, a clear perspective and a fruitful endeavor and work is birthed. And what a blessing that is. What a blessing that is. So now we find ourselves saying, I really would have not wanted to go through such pain at the hands of evil people, fraudulent people. But look at how we've been disciplined and humbled now. Look at how beautiful this new work we have is truly fascinating. So it's kind of like you didn't want Jesus to die on a cross. It must have been traumatic to see a man you loved nailed at a cross by hands of godless men, given to them by the hands of your own kind, your own culture, your own people. Like, it must have been a devastating trauma to witness, no doubt. And one can go back and say, man, that was bad, what they did to that man. He was innocent. Jesus was innocent. He did not deserve that shame and that those false accusations and charges and to be murdered. Not at all. But at the same time, it's really a blessing he did go through that he permitted himself to go through that, because now we have the gospel and our souls can be saved through his powerful blood and resurrection. His gospel, it's his Father. From the perspective of his Father, the nature of his Father written in the scripture, his Father was greatly angered at humanity to have crucified his Son. He had righteous anger and justified judgment upon the Jewish people. They murdered his Son. They should have received him, but they murdered him. He was angry, and they needed to be punished, and they were. But simultaneously, God the Father was greatly pleased at his Son's obedience to go through that pain for humanity, to be the conduit, to be the bridge to the Father. Sometimes we don't want to go through those pains. those moments in which you recognize betrayal at the hands of an individual you thought was a friend, that you become the recipient of slander, cunning lies, unrighteous, divisive ways, that you become the recipient of self-righteous hypocrites and their greed, their bitterness, their vindictiveness. We don't want that. And we try to avoid that at all costs. And we should, no doubt, by the prudency of the Scripture's insight. But at times it is a necessity to arrange us in our character, to humble us, and to at times save us, to withdraw us from such individuals, and to make us productive in a new chapter of life, a change, a new work. Discerning that and thanking God for it is a blessing of our reality. We'd love to have you come study with us. Check it out, eastcoastchurchofchrist.com, here on the East Coast of Canada. A true and pure, healthy, growing congregation. And you'd find that family love. Witness it for yourself. Come study with us. We have visitors every other week from all walks of life, from all kinds of different religious backgrounds, all of us together simply wanting to know the truth and follow the truth and have compassion and forgiveness for one another, to be kind to one another. And that's attractive. That's very attractive to a fallen world. And it is truly attractive to believers who may have been devoured or may have been intimidated and shackled in the vices of Pharisaical people, Pharisaical and toxic individuals. You don't need to remain in a local assembly governed by a corrupt leadership and corrupt people. You don't. You don't need to have anxiety attacks just to go to church because you know there's going to be unnecessary drama and confrontation and heavy-handed behaviors, and you don't go through this life that way. You don't. That's not Christianity. That does not. They may express it to be Christianity. It is not Christianity. It is not Christ-like at all. It's filled with hate and bitterness. Don't stay there. You don't need to stay there. Sometimes we find comfort under the wing of a dragon, just waiting to be devoured, burnt up. Spiritual refuge is a beautiful place that'll have us safe and secure, away from lawlessness, away from evil people doing evil things and evil actions. It will. We offer that. eastcoastchurchofchrist.com. Check it out. Stefan Maya is my name. AddedSouls.com is my website. It's been a pleasure to be with you all for this session. I hope we have learned something that we can set forth in our lives and grow stronger for. It's a blessing, really. We've been blessed with another day of life, breath in our lungs, a thinking mind. Most important to take hold of that opportunity and live faithfully towards Christ. It's a beautiful thing. My dear friends, stay focused and stay positive. You are loved. You are appreciated. And Lord willing, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time, we'll have ourselves another session. We go live from Tuesday to Friday, 9 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. If you want a bit more of my material or content, you can follow me on my Facebook page, Stefan Ashmaye. I'll share food. I'll share updates with the church. I'll share all kinds of stuff, a bit more personal. And if you want to even get a bit more in-depth and participate and partake in our efforts, you can support me and my family by signing up at addedsouls.locals.com. You can sign up and support there monthly. There's also the PayPal option, addedsouls@gmail.com. Or if you seek a physical address, by all means, just reach out to me. We'll have ourselves a conversation, and I will share with you our physical address. That okay? Good stuff. Peace out.